The reports began arriving at 0130 and did not stop. Paratroopers at Sainte Mère Église, paratroopers at Montebourg, paratroopers 20 kilometers inland, where no landing zone made any sense at all. Paratroopers south of Cotentin, in the flooded ground, in the hedgerows, on the roads, in the churchyards. A German staff officer trying to plot them on a map that night found himself drawing a picture with no shape. There was no axis of attack. There was no concentration. There was no line to defend against, because the enemy appeared to be everywhere and nowhere, in numbers that could not possibly exist. He had been trained for 4 years to answer one question: where is the main effort? That night, for the first time, the question had no answer. This is not a story about a battle for a town. No armored division broke through here. No general delivered a speech. The fight for Sainte Mère Église lasted a matter of hours and involved a few hundred men on each side. This is a story about what happens to a professional army when it loses the ability to describe what is happening to it, about a plan that went so badly wrong that it worked, and about a night in which the German command in Normandy was defeated not by force, but by the collapse of its own information. By dawn, the most experienced staff in Europe had stopped issuing orders and started asking questions. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the Germans had built. The Cotentin Peninsula in June 1944 was not open country. Behind the beaches lay a belt of ground the Germans had deliberately flooded, the Murderet and Douvre valleys, opened at the sluice gates and left to fill until the fields became shallow lakes, covered in grass, indistinguishable from pasture in aerial photographs. A man stepping into one at night in full equipment could drown in 4 feet of water without ever finding the bottom to push off from. Behind the floods sat the 91st Luftlande-Division, moved into the peninsula only weeks earlier, specifically to defend against airborne landings. It had been raised and trained for that mission. Its infantry, Grenadier Regiment 1058 among them, held the road junctions and the villages. Its artillery was registered on the fields the Germans themselves had identified as the only usable drop zones. The German assessment was not arrogant. It was arithmetic. Airborne troops land scattered, lightly armed, without artillery, and without vehicles. They must assemble before they can fight. If you know where they must land, and you have registered guns on that ground, you do not need to defeat them. You only need to reach them during the 90 minutes in which they are still trying to find each other in the dark. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It had worked in Crete against the Germans' own airborne arm, and it had worked in reverse everywhere the theory had been tested. Everything depended on the paratroopers landing where the Germans expected them to land. If you're finding this story worth your time, take a moment to subscribe. This channel exists for the chapters of the war that never make the popular accounts, and there are a great many more where this one came from. The man who commanded the 91st was Generalleutnant Wilhelm Falley, and he was exactly the officer you would want in that job. He had come up through the infantry, had commanded a division on the Eastern Front, and had been given the Cotentin because Rommel wanted a hard, experienced field commander holding the ground behind the beaches, rather than a garrison administrator. Falley understood his mission precisely. He had walked the flooded ground. He had ordered anti-glider obstacles, heavy stakes, later called Rommel's asparagus, driven into every open field wide enough to take a horsa. He had his guns laid. He had his reserves positioned to move on the drop zones within the hour. On the night of 5 June, Falley was not in the Cotentin. He was on the road to Rennes, where a map exercise had been called for the divisional commanders of Normandy. A war game. The subject of the exercise was how to respond to an Allied airborne landing. He turned his car around when the reports started coming in, and drove back through the dark toward his headquarters at Château de Berneville. The men falling into his sector had spent 2 years preparing for this, and roughly 90 seconds executing it. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division was not a new unit. It had jumped into Sicily in July 1943 and into Salerno in September, and it had learned in both places the lesson that no amount of training had been able to teach, that a night drop never goes as briefed. In Sicily, the regiment had been scattered across 60 miles of Italian coast. Officers had landed alone. Companies had fought as squads. Battalions had never assembled at all. The American answer to that was not tighter formation flying, it was doctrine. Every trooper was taught the mission of the man above him and the man above that one. Every trooper was told the objective of the battalion, not merely of his own stick. You attack alone toward the objective. If you find 2 men, you are a squad. If you find a lieutenant from another regiment, he is your officer. It was a system built on the assumption that the plan would fail. That assumption was about to be tested more thoroughly than anyone had imagined. The drop very nearly did not happen. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, had studied the Cotentin defenses and reached a conclusion he considered inescapable. The flooded ground, the obstacles, the anti-aircraft belt, and the 91st Division waiting on the drop zones would, in his estimate, destroy the American airborne divisions before they reached their objectives. He put the figure at up to 70% losses among the glider troops and 50% among the parachutists. He wrote to Eisenhower at the end of May and asked that the American airborne operation be cancelled. He described it, in effect, as the futile slaughter of 2 fine divisions. Eisenhower took a walk. He came back and overruled him. Without the airborne landings, the causeways behind Utah Beach could not be held, and without the causeways, Utah could not be sustained. There was no version of the invasion that did not require those men to jump. The order stood. Leigh-Mallory was informed by telephone. The transports crossed the coast at just after 1,100 on 6 June, and flew into a bank of cloud that had not been in any forecast. The formations broke apart in it. Pilots who had spent months learning to fly wingtip to wingtip lost sight of one another in seconds, and did the only safe thing, which was to scatter. When they came out the other side, they met anti-aircraft fire, and the fire pushed them further apart, and higher, and faster. Some crews dropped low, some dropped fast, almost none dropped where the plans said they would. The 82nd Airborne came down across an area roughly 25 miles wide. Sticks that should have landed together were separated by hours of walking. Men drowned in the flooded fields under the weight of their equipment before they could cut themselves free. Equipment bundles went into water and were never recovered. Of the regiment's mortars and machine guns, a large proportion simply vanished into the murderette. Over Sainte Mère Église itself, a house near the town square had caught fire, and the German garrison had turned out the villagers to fight it. The square was lit like a stage, full of people with buckets and soldiers standing guard, when the first aircraft came over low. Men of the 505th came down into that light. Some were killed in the air. One trooper's canopy caught on the church steeple and left him hanging above the square in full view of everyone in it. Private John Steele, who hung there for roughly 2 hours, playing dead, listening to the bell above his head until he could no longer hear anything at all. And at 0430, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss of the 3rd Battalion walked into Sainte Mère Église with about 180 men. A fraction of what he should have had. Cut the telephone cables, took the town, and raised an American flag over it. He had brought that flag with him from Naples for the purpose. What happened next in the German chain of command was worse than any defeat in the field. The reports arriving at Corps and Army headquarters described paratroopers across an area so vast that no staff officer could reconcile it with any rational plan. Adding to the confusion, hundreds of small dummy parachutists, burlap figures rigged with firecrackers, dropped in a separate deception operation, had come down in yet more locations, drawing German troops out to fight enemies that did not exist. The German command drew the only conclusion the evidence supported, which was the wrong one. The scattering was not a mistake. It had to be deliberate. No army would drop men that badly by accident. Therefore, the Americans had intended to saturate the entire peninsula, and therefore the main landing might be anywhere, and therefore the reserves must not be committed. Where the theory said the Germans would find the paratroopers assembling in the open, they instead found small groups of armed men behind them, beside them, and between them, cutting telephone wire and ambushing every vehicle that moved on every road at once. Generalleutnant Falley never reached his headquarters. His staff car ran into a small group of troopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment near Peekaville in the early morning. In the exchange that followed, Falley was killed on the road. The division, raised and trained specifically to defeat an airborne landing, lost its commander to the airborne landing before he could issue a single order about it. The consequences traveled outward for the rest of the day. The 91st Division, decapitated and fighting in a dozen directions, never mounted the concentrated counterattack on the drop zones that its entire existence had been designed around. The causeways behind Utah Beach were held. Utah, of all 5 landing beaches, came ashore at the lightest cost of the day. Sainte Mère Église became the first town in France liberated by the Allies. It was held through counterattacks all that day and into the next. And in the German after-action assessments, a note appears that would be repeated in various forms for the rest of the war. American airborne troops, when dispersed, do not become ineffective. They become unpredictable. Standard countermeasures assume an enemy that must concentrate before it can act. This enemy does not. Leigh-Mallory wrote to Eisenhower after the invasion. He said he had been wrong, that it was sometimes difficult to admit as much, and that he had never been more glad to have been overruled. Eisenhower kept the letter. John Steele survived. He was cut down by the Germans, taken prisoner, and escaped within days to rejoin his regiment. He came back to Sainte Mère Église many times after the war, and the town made him something close to family. There is a stained glass window in that church now, with paratroopers in it, and there is an effigy of a man in a parachute hanging permanently from the steeple, which is either a memorial or a joke, depending on which villager you ask, and is probably both. The German staff officer with the map was right about one thing. There was no shape to what happened that night. He was wrong about what that meant. He assumed that a picture without a shape was a picture he had failed to read. In fact, it was the picture. An army had been dropped in the wrong places by accident, and had gone on fighting toward the right ones anyway, because it had been trained for a night exactly like this one. A night when nothing worked, and every man had to decide for himself what the mission required. You cannot plot that on a map. That is the whole reason it worked.